Right, British betrayal and the Balfour Declaration. Before we go back to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, 100 years ago, come November the 2nd, the declaration that got this whole Palestine-Israel mess going in the first place, let's quickly fast forward to 1946. On an ordinary working day on July 22nd, 1946, an explosion ripped through the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. 91 people were killed, including 41 Palestinian Christian Muslims, 17 Jews, and 28 Britons. The hotel was the British administrative headquarters for Mandatory Palestine, and the perpetrators were members of the Irgun, a Zionist underground militant organization who wanted to create the State of Israel and were using any means to get it. In response, Britain simply forbade its soldiers from literally hanging out in Jewish places of entertainment, cafes, restaurants, shops, private dwellings. What a lame response to a terrorist attack. And it was one of a long line of Britain's betrayals of the people of Palestine, and a long line of Britain's acceptance of allowing the future state of Israel to act with impunity, regardless of international law. Right, so let's go back. During the First World War, an Arab uprising, aided by the British, drove the Ottomans out of the Levant. The Levant being Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, that area and a bit beyond. The UK had pledged that it would honor Arab independence if they revolted against the Turks with them. Meanwhile, they made a secret pact, surprise, surprise, with the French to divide the region into British and French spheres of influence. A year later, in 1917, the UK's Foreign Secretary, Arthur James Balfour, sent a letter to Baron Walter Rothschild, a member or former member of Parliament and the leader of the British Jewish community. The letter was intended to be transmitted to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland, which advocated for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, despite the fact that at the time, Jews made up roughly 10% of the population of Palestine, and most were fairly recent immigrant arrivals, and despite the fact that Palestine was not Britain's to give away. The letter became known as the Balfour Declaration, and stated in part, I'll quote, "His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object." Soon afterwards, Britain obtained a mandate from the League of Nations to administer Palestine, quote, "until such time as they are able to stand alone," end quote. Given the British pledge to establish a Jewish homeland in their midst, native Palestinians watched with dismay as Jewish immigration intensified from Europe, and the Jewish community established its own proto-government and military. In 1936, the Palestinians rebelled again, this time against their British occupiers who threatened to allow newcomers to permanently usurp their country. It began as non-violent strikes and other forms of political protest, but escalated to violent resistance. Britain brutally crushed the resistance, leaving native Palestinians largely defenseless and leaderless, as the Zionist community continued to grow in strength and numbers. For their part, the Zionists resented any British restriction on their Jewish immigration from Europe whatsoever, and Zionist terrorist militias began engaging in terrorism, assassinations, and sabotage to try and force the British to leave, culminating in the bombing mentioned at the beginning at the King David Hotel. Soon after the King David Hotel bombing, the British became fed up with the whole situation and turned it over to the UN. The General Assembly, steeped in the guilt of the Holocaust, recommended a partition plan that would give more than half of Palestine over to Zionist rule, even though at the time Jews now made up less than 1/3 of the population. native Palestinians rejected the deal and couldn't understand why they would be forced to give up their homes and their lands, but were no match for well-armed and well-organized Zionist militias who conquered 78% of the territory and now control all of it. Considering how much responsibility Britain has for the events which led to the occupation of Palestine and the ensuing ocean of injustice, you would think the British government would have a special relationship with the Palestinians they had betrayed. But the reality is the opposite. To this day, like its American counterparts, mainstream British politicians give preferential treatment to Israeli authorities. They frequently support them on the world stage, continue trading arms with them, do little to enforce international law on them. They literally reiterate talking points given to them by the Israeli government. It is so offensive to Palestinians and to anyone of goodwill for the Balfour Declaration, a colonial arrogance that led to the destruction, dispossession, and oppression of so many, to be celebrated. An apology is due instead by the British for unleashing the Zionist colonial enterprise. But an apology must come with the recognition that the past is not the past, that the settler colonial project is ongoing, as you can see with the illegal settlements that are still being built, and that Britain continues to be complicit in the suffering of the Palestinians through its diplomatic and trade relations with Israel. As such, any apology demands British policy changes that would sanction Israel and hold it to account for its international human rights violations. In this way, the Balfour Declaration would not be historicized as a thing of the past, but would be revealed as a document whose legacy continues to have drastic and devastating consequences for the Palestinian people.